My name is Nick, and I'm on the Vancouver Startup Week team. Before we begin today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are grateful to be virtually gathered here on Indigenous land, regardless of where you're joining us from. I'm grateful to be on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. Unceded means these territories were never handed over, sold, or given up by these nations, and currently we are situated on occupied territories. With that being said, I want to thank all of you for joining us here today for Vancouver Startup Week 2021, and welcome to Granted Consulting's session here today. Are you missing out on government grants? Learn how to get non-dilutive funding for your business. I especially would like to thank Granted Consulting today for being an event partner and also a sponsor for Vancouver Startup Week. Vancouver Startup Week could not happen without the continuous support from our community sponsors. So thank you very much. If you have any questions for our speakers, please post them in the Q&A in the Whova session, and you can also upvote any questions that you think are particularly important. So now I'll pass the mic over to Floyd, and I'll let him begin the session. So thanks, Floyd.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone. Let's go through a couple of grants today and the logic behind it. Let me start by sharing my screen. Please feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll pick them up near the end. There we go. I hope you can all see it appropriately. Let me go to the appropriate one. There we go. All right. If you see nothing, then something is wrong, so please let me know. But I think this ought to be working. Yeah, so hello, everyone. Let's kick this off. First of all, I always like starting with this one. You know, this is definitely something I repeat very often. Only 4.9% of small to medium-sized businesses in Canada are currently leveraging grants. Those numbers are pre-COVID, and certainly since COVID, that has changed quite a bit. However, the core bread and butter grants haven't changed quite a bit in how many companies are using them, even though 100% could be using those grants. It's just changed because COVID programs are often used, but actual core grants that are around year in, year out in one form or another are not being appropriately leveraged. And in under normal circumstances, over 26 billion gets distributed every single year. And there's actually programs out there that are unable to distribute all the money they have that they want to give to companies, just because not enough people are aware and not enough people are applying. And it doesn't need to be overly difficult. You just kind of need to appropriately know what they are and then spend time on it, and then you know, do it in a kind of an efficient way. Big question is, are you missing out? Probably the answer is yes, really. So today we'll go over a couple things, common misconceptions of grants. I'll start with that. There's a bunch of them, and I'll go over them individually. Also, the business requirements to be grantable. You'll see it's really not that hard, and not that much is required to get grants for yourself as well. I'll detail the types of grants available, particularly the core bread and butter ones that aren't necessarily overly project specific and can be leveraged throughout. Including best practices, we'll discuss after that. And I'll also detail a few really hot grants right now in case you want to action them immediately. A little before that, a little bit of background on Granted. Granted was founded in 2011 officially. However, Stephanie Sang started the company already in 2008. Obviously, there was a 2008 crisis. After a crisis, tons of grants come out. That was certainly the case then. That is also the case right now. The government fiscal year just started in April. Budget announcements were made. Lots of money is being dumped into grants. It's going to be a record-breaking grant year. So if ever there was a year where you shouldn't be missing out, it's right now, basically. And ever since, we helped over 10,000 grant applications, over 850 companies. We have about 93% success rate helping clients directly. It's something we're quite proud of, because that can be difficult to achieve in the market. All of which I mean to say, we certainly have a lot of experience with these grants, basically. Next up, common misconceptions. So there's definitely a few that I have to go through pretty often. So I'm just going to pick these up individually. First of all, people often assume you get grant money up front. That is incredibly rare and not rote or routine. Generally speaking, grants are about future action in a way that before you incur cost in the activity, you have to do the grant first. Often you have to be approved for the grant, so you may have to wait for adjudication on that grant as well. Then you can incur the costs, then you pay for the costs, and then with those receipts in hand, you can get reimbursement, a percentage that was involved with the grant you were approved for. Almost all grants work like that. And a couple of requirements come out of that. You need to have decent cash flow, for example, because you got to pay for stuff first and then get reimbursed for it, basically, right? So yeah, there are exceptions, and then overall as well, some particular grants, if you go in for a second or third try and government's seeing that you can deliver, because the first time you delivered as to the program's goal and you created something real, for example, they might be more amenable to A, give you more money that you requested, and also B, I've seen it happen that some money is distributed upfront after a couple times. So it is technically possible. It's just really rare. Some of the R&D grants do have it, like IRAP, for example, but that's kind of a specific case, and we'll get to that as well. Another one I get sometimes that grants are sort of fixed and don't change throughout the year. Nothing is further from the truth. How it works and also why so few companies are appropriately leveraging grants is that there's lots of delivery organizations out there. They pitch to the government to distribute parts of a bucket, all with their own criteria, detail, processes, all of it. And some of them, not all, some of them need a little bit of help as well with communication and transparency and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, they all have their own processes and application forms and that kind of stuff. So it can be difficult to navigate. They also don't necessarily have the same distribution rights the next year or the year after. Often contracts go for a couple of years. And also new grants are coming out left and right as well. And every single year, almost every grant has a couple changes. So certainly it's a changing landscape, which is part of the reason why a lot of companies struggle with staying on top of that, just because it's quite time consuming, you know, research team, basically. Then the big one, and I've on purpose left that circle the largest one, because this is my most common inquiry. Grants are mostly available for startups. Actually, the opposite is true. Government generally doesn't like giving money to startups because they want to see economic impact from the money they make available for companies to grow or hire people, for example. And you know, obviously the risk is a little bit higher with startups that doesn't actually lead to the economic impact that they hope for. So they tend to focus on slightly more established businesses, and we'll get to some criteria in the future. And actually, it's a little bit harder for startups. Not all grants apply, but I will get to a little bit more detail down the road on this. Then next one, grants are only for certain industries. Certainly not the case. There's lots of grants out there, and hiring, training, or market expansion grants, and we'll get to some details with those, are applicable to pretty much anyone. Sometimes you have extra amazing grants in specific industries, like food related, for example, really great grants out there, or STEM or digital tech, and we'll get to a couple of those as well. But certainly any industry can leverage grants. And then next one up is grants are similar to loans, and they're not, because you don't have to pay them back, and that is certainly the most amazing part about a grant, and I think why many of you are here today as well. And then lastly, grants are for buying equipment and such. I get a lot of inquiries and people reaching out like, hey, I want to start a new plant or a new office and I need a grant to help me do that, or buy equipment, expensive equipment. Government does not like putting money into CapEx related things. Very few grants available that cover equipment. Recently, there was one, the Scale Up Manufacturing Grant for $250K, extremely competitive as a result, because it did cover some equipment cost. But yeah, it's really rare, and that's also why such a grant, when it does come out, is incredibly competitive. So you might have to wonder as well, like, how well do you meet the criteria? And if you don't meet them perfectly, and even if you do meet them, you might still not get it, because there's way more people asking for such a grant than actually gets awarded in the end. Yeah, so a couple of misconceptions. Then next one up, so requirements are relatively simple for any business to get grants. Generally speaking, almost all grants require that you've been registered for at least a year. Many of them as well require a certain revenue threshold. For example, 100K in revenue in your last fiscal, which is, for example, important for a market expansion grant. Generally speaking, the more traction you have or capacity up to a certain point, because it is focused on small to medium-sized businesses, many of these grants up to a certain point, the more you have been established, the more likely you can leverage something, or you might get priority out of it, or higher amounts awarded. There's one exception here, and that is hiring grants. Hiring grants are available to almost any organization. If you are offering a real job, and we'll get to some more details a little bit later in this presentation, you can leverage hiring grants. So that one is particularly accessible for startups as well. Then another requirement is internal capacity. Like you still need to be able to find the grants, but also you need to be able to, write them up, submit it, do all the claims. Sometimes there's reporting requirements after as well, so the funder can figure out if the money was used in an appropriate way and led to the economic impact that they are also incentivized on. I mean, that's obviously the purpose of the program, generally speaking. So the big question is, can you figure it out? Can you manage all the steps? That's definitely something you need, and often where it goes wrong for many smaller organizations. And then lastly, and we kind of touched upon this one already a little bit, cash flow. You got to pay first, get reimbursed later. So we got to have the money to be able to hire someone, basically. And then many won't cover the full expense either. So, generally speaking, most things won't be completely free. You still have to pay a percentage, basically. All right, I'll start with this one. I'll be brief about this one. Innovation grants, R&D related grants get a lot of attention and a lot of questions, generally speaking. Granted doesn't necessarily focus on these sort of bigger R&D related grants. They are generally about, you have to do something that relates to innovation, to advance technological, in general, technological advancement. You can apply a technology in a completely new way, or you could be building new technology. And as long as there's some kind of risk element to it, like you are developing something you're not 100% sure it'll work out, and maybe you need to do some experimenting as well, then it gets more eligible. Shred is effectively a tax credit where you get a bunch of money back that you've already spent on developing tech. Both Capital is a good place to go. There, I think that presentation as well. I'm not 100% sure on that. You can get up to 35% tax credit. And then lastly, IRAP. If you're not familiar with IRAP and you are representing a tech startup, please contact them. There's a general phone number there, which is generally the best way to get in touch with them. You get your own ITA, a technology industry technological advisor, I think what that stands for. And then you can discuss. As granted, we cannot be involved with IRAP. They don't allow for any third parties. We highly recommend, there's a lot of really good ITAs out there that can be just incredibly helpful for your business in general. If you don't have one now, I would certainly recommend you contact them. Then some detail on hiring grants, training grants, and market expansion grants. These three types are generally speaking sort of the bread and butter of grants that most companies can access. Hiring grants come in two overall varieties, sort of broad categories. One is for temporary hires for students, co-ops, interns, that kind of thing, usually up to 4 months. And you can get anywhere between $2,000 to $10,000 back for a hire like that. Very common use there is temporary projects, market research, admin work. I mean, I've talked to a water park that gets 50 of them student grants every single year and have them work as lifeguards during summer. Provides some flexibility there. Obviously, a common pushback companies give when thinking about hiring students is that they require a lot more effort. Government is there to help out to make that worth your time a little bit more, basically. And then what decides between 2 to 10 depends a little bit on time of year, program, candidate, that kind of stuff. Generally speaking, the student ones are available all year round in one form or another, though, which provides some flexibility. Then the other kind is for full-time hires. These are generally definitely way cooler. And I have a couple of examples at the end of this presentation as well. I mean, the best one by far, COVID had some of their amounts doubled and also pushed some of the reimbursement percentages up to 100%. This is going to be temporary, most likely, but they are putting more money into it now overall. That will be distributed over the next 6 months or so. But regardless, you get 100% up to 30K back, particularly for a digital or tech hire, but a little bit more detail on that later. There's also good backup options for other types of positions. Generally speaking, STEM-oriented positions get a bit more money allocated to them, or you get priority access to a competitive program, for example. Similarly, if it's visible minority, protected persons, people with disabilities, those tend to get priority access to those kinds of grants and or higher amounts awarded as well, basically. Yeah, these are really great grants. these full-time hiring grants tend to come around in sort of a wave-like pattern. Like last big wave, we had those big hiring grants for September, October, and now we're in the middle of one as well. That means they aren't always available, and they require some quick action and really being on the ball, because you kind of got to be aware of when they come out and which one to apply to. A challenge there, usually number one challenge with hiring grants, is that there are a lot of delivery organizations out there, all for the same program. They do their own variation with slight differences, like different targeting, different processes, slightly different criteria. Also the way they pay out is a little bit different. So finding them and identifying the one that fits your needs the most is basically 80% of the battle when it comes to hiring grants. Once you've found the appropriate one, it's really easy. It doesn't take you a whole lot of time to apply to that grant. It's really finding it where the challenge lies, and I have a couple tips on that near the end as well, specific ones to go for. Then there's training grants. Training grants are not available to most startups because they have a hard requirement that it's only for employees who are on payroll. So you're usually going to have a couple of those, and then so not contractors, like really people on payroll. And you got to be incorporated for at least a year to leverage training grants. And then most people will probably agree, sending people to courses, because that's what this is about, usually not priority number one for most startups. So we don't do a lot of these for most startups. That being said, they are pretty great. They are province specific, these training grants, and they're quite different. They're not that different in content by province, but they are different sometimes in criteria or how competitive they are by province. Like it's really easy to get one in Alberta. It's getting more difficult to get one in BC lately. It comes down to you get 60 to 100% back of the course. It's actually not wages. I see that I made a mistake there in the text. It's 60 to 100% of the course you get back. And then it's really about sending an employee to an external training course that must have a clear beginning, middle, and end, a course outline, basically. And then the more you can argue that your organization needs those skills to survive in the future, and the person who's taking the course gets a better job position out of it, the more that is the case, the more you can get reimbursed, up to 100% reimbursed if someone is from a lower skilled wage job, specific NOC codes, and then gets a promotion out of it. It's 100% up to 10K per individual. So they're pretty good. To give you an indication there, almost anything goes with sort of the last stream, which is called workforce in BC. Almost any course can go through that, including soft skills. Very common ones we see there are leadership training, management courses, sales training, marketing courses, those kinds. And I mean, our granted team is currently engaged in mindfulness training, and we're getting 60% back of that, up to 5K per individual as well. So these training grants can be a really great way to train employees, to motivate them, but also make them more useful inside an organization, and you get a bunch of money back that way. And obviously, Canadian government likes it in a way that if you enable upskilling of your workforce, the economy benefits, basically. And then lastly, of market expansion grants, those are up to 75% for a max of $100,000 per year. They are focused specifically on expanding abroad in a country where, or region for specific countries, where you don't have a whole lot of presence yet, which is defined as less than $100,000 in revenue in that market last year, in your last fiscal, or less than 10% of your total international sales. The US is split into 4 regions, meaning if you're sitting here and be like, oh, we sell a lot to the US, but I think we just breached 100K US wide, there might be options for you, because each of those 4 regions in the States is deemed their own market with their own criteria. In other words, if you've had a bunch of sales on the West Coast, for example, but not on the East Coast or Midwest, then you can still get a market expansion grant, a can export for that particular grant, basically. One exception there, particularly in the agri-food space, there's really amazing market expansion grants that are local or cross province as well. Only in that space though. Generally, there's really great grants available in the agri-food space. Also hiring grant. So that one, some more detail on it in terms of eligible expenses. So hiring is 99% about salaries. The occasional hiring program here and there will also have a training element to it as an extra on top. Often that can be converted into salary as well in terms of bumping the amount a little. Training is specifically about these kinds of costs. Most of it really is the course cost. That's usually the most important. And then market expansion grants are a really interesting grant in general. So trade shows is common. It used to be about travel, but you can't even mention it anymore. Otherwise, you're going to get a rejection pretty much right away on the Can Export grant. But up to $50,000 in digital advertising can get reimbursed. Free marketing, basically. Obviously, you get 75% back on 100 if you're approved for it. Also, up to 50K in consulting fees can get reimbursed along the lines of marketing agencies or salespeople you hire that are project-based to help you figure out how to penetrate a market or have some specific deliverables in X amount of time. Other common usages are new packaging you have to figure out for the new country. For example, legal fees because you have lawyers and you need new contracts. For example, that kind of stuff. It's up to 75K, that one. However, there are some challenges with it, and I'll just continue first on the market expansion one. So it doesn't involve any capex, like I mentioned earlier, that also applies to the Can Export grant. No equipment, no rent, no wages. That's not what the Can Export grant is about. It's specifically about the things I previously mentioned. Right now, almost 60% of Can Exports get rejected. That's roughly the ratio right now. They're very competitive. And also, you might go in and be like, hey, I'm going to spend 100K in eligible expenses in 6 months. Can you please help me, Canadian government? And here's my application, right, for a Can Export. But you're liable to get approved the first time for, if you get approved, for 30, 35 or something like that. And that's something to take into account. They're pretty strict, so they will cut specific individual line items and then keep other ones. And for the ones you have been approved, you get 75% back. Basically, and the ones you haven't been approved for, you can choose not to execute. And basically, that's really up to you. It's something to take into account. It gets better on the second and third try. A Can Export grant, like you could still be eligible. Period is over. Poof, let's go do another. You have a max of 100K within a fiscal year, so it generally makes sense to do a second or third if you can. And we certainly like doing that with our clients. And yeah, you get higher amounts awarded too. So that is a very competitive one. So, and it's also quite the project and quite a bit of work, these Can Exports. So only pursue them if you actually plan to have a project-based growth plan in X number of months where you can spend up to 100K in those eligible expenses. Basically, it's not something you do on the side for cost you're incurring already. It is too much work for that, really. Something to take into account, because I get that a lot, right? Like, oh, we already get some cost there. How about, getting a Can Export to get some of it back? It only makes sense if you're like, I'm going to spend 80K or something in 6 months. Let's write them up, So yeah. Then ineligible expenses for hiring. So it's more really about who is eligible and who isn't. Generally speaking, hiring grants are focused on people that are 30 years old or younger. Government defines that is the definition of youth for the government. Government likes helping young people get jobs and less so people that are more experienced. And there's generally no grants available for those. Only in BC there's a backup, and I'll get to that on the last slide with the grant recommendations, where you do get some money for someone who is older than 30 years. There's also a 55 plus grant, but it's tiny and barely worth mentioning. We actually have never done that one, I think. Yeah, not the most popular program. So yeah, keep that in mind. Focused on youth. It does not apply to existing hires. It's really just for starting a new person. Sometimes you get the cheeky question, what if I fire the person and rehire, can I get a grant? No, that's not going to work for you, basically. Hiring grants also don't work in terms of hiring contractors. It must be about putting someone on payroll. Government cares about that. Government doesn't view it as a real employee unless they're on payroll, and that's what the hiring grants are for. I put an asterisk next to it because there is something interesting with that. Some grants say specifically that it must be net new or something, like it cannot apply to someone who was already a contractor before. It must be a completely new person. Not all grants, however, do that. Meaning, if you have a bunch of contractors, and they're working a lot for your company, there might be hiring grants available to put them on payroll. So not much needs to change except you put them on payroll and then you get a whole bunch of money back, basically. Pretty sweet. And lastly, recruitment costs don't work. With training, there's particularly one thing to be aware of. Actually, two things. I'll mention two things in terms of ineligible stuff. One is the moment the course you send someone to involves also coaching, mentoring, consulting, or sort of discretionary ongoing things, it is immediately ineligible. It cannot be that. It must be a specific course that has a clear beginning, middle, end, and outline, steps, deliverables, and an instructor. If there's anything ongoing that isn't completely separate, it's not going to be eligible. And then the other thing, and particularly in BC, this has been coming up because it's very competitive in BC. You have to sort of, the funders actively look at the alternatives in the market, and if they feel like the one you're going for is expensive or not properly sort of reason why this one, why not another one, they might reject you as well. And then it takes them 2 to 3 months right now to get you an answer on if you've been approved or not. So if you're like, I am not going to do this training course, and this is BC specific, by the way, that period, it's a lot faster in Alberta. It's also faster in Ontario right now. But if you're like, I'm not going to take this course unless I get a bunch of money back for it, then yeah, start really early, 2 to 3 months in advance at least. You got to start. If you're like, I'm going to take this course anyway, whether I get a training grant for it or not, then you just need to submit the grant and hope for the best after. But you can start pretty much right away after submit, basically. I hope that helps a little bit on these. I'll detail a few hot grants right now because they are pretty awesome and they should work for most of you. One is, this is a BC specific one, but I listed here because it's glorious. It's kind of the backup one. It's called the Work BC Hiring Grant. You can get 7.2K to 12K for a new hire in most cases. This is the only program, as far as we know right now, this is the only program that allows to get some money back on a hire that is older than 30 years. That's when the 7.2K comes in. If it's actually younger than 30 years, you get the 12K. And it's a really good backup because it also is usable for positions that aren't otherwise super grantable with other programs. The next one I'm going to talk about is digital tech related, for example. Let's say you're hiring an account manager, straight up, you can get a Work BC hiring grant for that one. And depending on the age, it's 7.2 or 12K. There are similar programs in other provinces, but not with the 30 plus element specifically. So yeah, something to take into account. Then a really popular one that many of you will probably have heard of is called DS4Y, Digital Skills for Youth Hiring Grant. This is the one that came about in September, October in a wave last year as well. You can get up to $30,000 back for a hire like that, as long as they're younger than 30 and in a digital or tech related role. There is some flexibility there in a sense that the most common role we do for this type of grant is social media manager, marketing related, basically. However, like also developers, technicians, engineers can work. And on occasion, like operations manager, as long as there's a real significant focus on the digital and tech related elements of their work, for example, then that might work as well. Because these grants had their amounts doubled because of COVID in the last wave in September, October, and it's up to 100% reimbursement, they have become remarkably competitive. So one opened up earlier in May, actually mid-May, one opened up, and then normally they do first come, first serve. This one was sort of a cutoff date, and then they decide, and it's Career Launcher, it's called. It's sort of related to this one. And they had 160 spots, and they had, in the first half hour or something like that, they had 400 draft applications, and it was open for multiple weeks. So you can kind of see where this is going at. You got to be kind of a perfect fit and really jump on it. Otherwise, you may not get it. There's other, so DS4Y is also marked by having lots of delivery organizations, all with their own criteria, details, spots, budgets, etc. And many of these are still coming out. So in June and July, and also after, we expect more spots from different delivery organizations to open up. If you're like, oh my God, this is great, where do I go? I want to check it out. Have a look at VCN, VCN. They're the biggest one, delivery organization. They are currently not open to new ones. It's actually somewhat difficult to get input from them, despite many attempts. But they're currently not open for new ones, just old ones that were already in the last wave but missed out. But they will be getting new placements and opening them up to new ones as well. And there's also lots of other delivery organizations coming there. I'm on time, I'm good. All right, and then lastly, soft landing scale from home, a really good one, applicable to many. It's opening on May 31st. We just learned about it last week or a week and a half ago, along those lines. It's for tech companies that launch a product that generates revenue. You get $4,000 back in expansion costs. You know, trade shows, sales activity, marketing things. So if you have a product, it's generating revenue, check it out. For 4K, what you get back, it's going to be a really easy application process, I'm sure. We haven't seen it yet because it's not quite open yet, but it's going to be really simple. So I would stay on that one and fill it out the moment it opens up on May 31st. Maybe you get a 4K check sent your way for cost you already incurring anyway, basically. Lastly, I got some questions about this tool. It's not on this slide, but I'll quickly mention it. There's the Launch Online grant. This is 7.5K. They put a whole lot of additional millions into that not so long ago. This is particularly relevant for companies that are kind of non-tech, and they have core operations, be that retail or something like that, and they also want to have an online store in addition that at this moment either doesn't exist or is super bare bones, doesn't have a lot of features. Then you get 7.5K to help you launch online. I get a lot of questions about it because a lot of tech companies are like, yeah, I have an online shop. Can I get this 7.5K? No, because you are an online tech company. It's aimed at helping those who aren't also become online, basically. All right, then best practices. How do you actually stay on top of these grants and leverage them when they come out, and the appropriate ones at that? So generally speaking, like when you're looking at a grant, try to understand government intentions. That helps you a long way in figuring out if you're actually eligible. Would you help towards the government's goals with this funding? If the answer is a resounding yes, then maybe you can get it. That also informs you a little bit on how to write it up, because many of them is all about the power of the arguing when you actually submit a grant. And then if you can properly argue like, hey, you know, this makes complete sense because X, Y, Z, and we're going to create jobs and positive economic impact with and stuff like that, then the government likes hearing that kind of stuff. So that helps a lot as well. Then stay up to date with research. That's a tough one. We have a whole team for it. Sometimes they require really quick action, especially if they're retroactive, which does happen every now and then. And a retroactive hiring grant is basically you've already hired someone in the past and you can still get a bunch of money back for it. Those require immediate action, otherwise they're gone. One way to do it is check out Granted. Obviously, we stay on top of that for all our clients. There's also other knowledge tools out there you can check. One recently is a friend competitor. You know, we're all in the same space. Pocketed might be worth checking out. They're mostly sort of basic information. We're more on the in-depth side, but it does allow you to sort of stay on top of what's coming out there. And then lastly, plan ahead. That's where it all comes down to. Like the most common reason why it goes wrong is, oh yeah, we're hiring someone 2 days from now. Oh, we should get a grant. Too late. You should do this in advance. For a hiring grant, at least 2 weeks in advance. Most of the time you have to have a candidate in hand as well. Before you can actually apply to the hiring grant. For training, like I said, 2 to 3 months is much better time. And for can export, again, 3 months in advance at least. It takes a while. It takes them 60 business days to adjudicate, and it's going to take you. If we do, it takes us about 3 weeks to write it up and submit it, and that requires some quick sort of interaction with the client as well. So what I'm saying is start early and plan ahead, basically. And that is it. And I'm open to any questions.
Oh, thank you, Floyd. A lot of great info there. We have some questions here on the on Whova, so I'm just gonna read them out to you.
Okay.
And if any other attendees have any questions, feel free to drop them in now, and yeah, I'll get around to asking them after. So first question we have here is, which of these grants are valid for contractors? So I'm assuming if you're not hiring but you're contracting workers, what grants are?
Pretty much nothing. I mean, look, if you're in an organization that is incorporated and just happens to all be contractors, I mean, there's grants available for the organization that are sort of irrespective of the individual. Like Can Export requires some people on payroll generally, but that might still work because it doesn't involve wages. You might get a hiring grant to put a contractor on payroll. That's pretty much it, yeah.
So, thank you. Next question on here. If I want to work with Granted to help us with grants, what should I do? Or how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, good question. So two things, actually should have linked the other one too here, but if you're a startup and you're a little bit early stage, that means there's a limited amount of ways we can actually help you. If you Google Granted startups, there's a good blog post that gives you further information how to deal with grants and stuff like that. If you're like, I just want to check it out and see if Granted can help out, go to this URL you currently see on the screen. You can also go to the homepage in the top right. It says Get Started. It basically leads you there. There is a calculator on that page. You can fill out some details and it spits out a number that theoretically you ought to be grantable for. This does some filtering as well. Like, we will lead you to appropriate resources that serve your needs the best. Or if you meet certain criteria, you can talk to one of us. I say like that because we get a lot of inbound questions, and then many early stage startups that we can't actively help. So we do some filtering. We can't field every single one in a call, unfortunately, just because the volume is rather enormous, and then we don't get around to much else. So we do some filtering, but we are open for questions, and there's a variety of ways of contacting us. One other thing I'll say there as well, we also have a self-serve option called Get Granted. You can subscribe to it. There's a free version, there's paid versions. The idea there basically is a database of grants out there, continuously updated, but then in plain bullet point English. The idea there being, here's all the knowledge, good luck, we're not otherwise super involved. So that's sort of the self-serve option.
Yeah, I just answered my next question, actually. Where can small business owners or startup founders find the way to sign up for that?
Right. So if you go to our granted.ca website, there's also a self-serve button up there. It's called Get Granted, but you'll find it with self-serve. Check it out. There's a lot of information on there. And yeah, you can sign up for free or do one of the paid plans. An alternative, like I mentioned, is Pocketed, which the free version gives slightly more information than our free version, if I'm honest about it, that you don't have the in-depth stuff and they don't help you directly. So there's a difference there.
Right. Next question on here. What's the general fee arrangement for using consulting companies like Granted? Is it contingency based, for example?
Another great question. Yes, so we like it being win-win as much as possible. How we work is because grants are about future action, it makes sense to plan ahead, right? So most clients we hook up with a dedicated consultant who knows most about the space and industry, starts with a strategy call, like what are your needs, what do we know about grants, how we can get the most out of it. And there's a couple other ways, like there's emails too and catch-ups. That starts with an annual fee. For most organizations at $1,500 on an annual fee, unless you're huge or have a complex setup with many entities, then it's double, $3,000, because then we have to hook up a senior consultant, basically. And then there's a 20% success fee on the approved amount of the grant, specifically on the approved amount of the grant, not the submitted amount. And then on date of approval, we send out an invoice for 20% of the approved amount with 4 months net payment term. The idea there being, you should be able to get some reimbursements before we ask for a 20% of total approved amount. So mostly it is success fee based. And generally speaking, our rule is if the $1,500 isn't like close to nothing compared to the grant dollars we can get you, we don't want to do it either. And we can't work together in that way. There is a backup. I'll briefly highlight that as well. Some companies want to start with a one-off, no annual fees, no dedicated consultant, no strategy element, but 30% success fee, as opposed to 20% that our clients are getting or an annual fee, basically. Lastly, and this is an important note as well, there's a variety of different grants out there, from local, regional, provincial, federal. Some of them, and usually the ones that are more famous, are very large grants, 250K, 500K, even $1 million. Those tend to be a little bit more famous. Those are often technical in nature, require a lot of expertise to write. So we would have to be onboarded in the tech as long as it takes the engineer to write the grant. We don't actively do those kinds of grants. There are consultants for those larger grants. They charge typically 3, 4, 5% are common percentages. We ask 20% of the approved amount because we do a different category of grants, namely lower value ones, and then 5% doesn't make sense. I mean, we also do training grants that are like $100, right? So, and also thousands, but also $100. So just so you sort of understand how that industry works. And there's different grant writers out there that charge different rates for that reason.
Right. Well, thank you, Floyd. That looks like it for questions that we have. I guess just one last thing, if you have any, there's like one thing you'd like viewers to take away from this presentation, what would that big takeaway be?
Yeah, good question. I think the number one thing of all is if you are hiring someone who is Canadian or PR or accepted refugee, a protected person, and you are not getting a hiring grant, you're probably missing out. There's money you could be leveraging that you're currently not. That's usually the most accessible grant for most people.